So today I will explain why I believe Latin America is set to shine economically over the next decades. I strongly believe that we are going to see a major shift in the world's capital flows towards Latin America. And currently, my main bet is on Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. You see, Latin America has never been a huge destination for investments. After all, most people see this region as being not friendly at all to capital, very corrupt and poor. So, to this day, Latin America has been kind of avoided, but I think the scenario is likely to change completely. Now, why do I believe that? Because basically, while developed countries are facing a very challenging scenario, when you look at these Latin American nations, the picture is the complete opposite. Now, let's break that down. So for me, there's mainly three factors why Latin America is set to shine economically. The first factor is demographics. So, for example, while most developed countries are facing a very serious demographic problem, with their populations aging really fast, these Latin American nations have large young populations. Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at Japan's population, for instance. Most of it is over 40 years old. Young people in Japan are a minority. As we can see, Japan's birth rate is falling off a cliff, and fewer young people are entering the scene. That means that in the long run, Japan's population is set to shrink dramatically. And obviously, that's a very serious economic problem, since fewer people mean not only a shrinking labor force, but also a smaller consumer base, which diminishes growth on both sides of the economy. Or take Germany, for example, where the same thing is happening. Most people there are not young but old. As we can see here, the share of the population that's 30 years old or younger is relatively small. Or look at Italy, for instance, where we see the same grotesque picture. If Italy continues like this, its population will collapse in the long run. And you will find a very similar situation in most developed countries. Now, why is this a phenomenon of developed nations? Well, I think this comes down to a few factors. So first, fewer children are a phenomenon of developed nations because they were the ones that industrialized first. And when a country goes through industrialization, people tend to leave the countryside and move to the cities. The problem is that, while in the countryside, children usually are an asset, meaning more hands to work, in the cities, they become a liability, meaning they're just another cost. So obviously, people tend to have fewer children as modernization and industrialization take place. Moreover, in my opinion, when a country modernizes and becomes wealthy, its culture tends to become more secular and more self-centered, leaving less and less room for kids. In a lot of Western countries, many people simply don't want to have kids because they want to travel, they want to be free. In summary, they don't want long-term commitments, right? They want to enjoy life, which is a concept much more common in richer nations. So in my view, these are the main reasons why we see this picture when we look at the populations of developed countries. On the other hand, if we look to these Latin American countries I mentioned, the picture is the complete opposite. For example, look at Argentina's population. Most people are under 40, as we see here. Or look at Paraguay's population. By far, most people are still young, under 40 years old. Or look at Mexico's population. Again, a huge young population. And lastly, look at Uruguay, with a large share of its population still being young. So while European and Asian developed countries are aging really fast, these Latin American nations present the opposite picture, a very young population, which means a huge potential consumer market in the future, as well as a large potential labor force. So that's the first factor, that's the first reason why I believe Latin America is set to shine economically over the next decades: demographics. Now let's move on to the second key factor why I believe Latin America is set to shine. So the other reason why I think these Latin American countries will steal the show over the coming decades is because of the fiscal factor. Now, I'm going to break this topic into two parts. First, we'll talk about debt and then about taxes. You see, most developed countries are extremely leveraged, completely drowning in debt. For example, look at France, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 113%, or Spain, with 102%, or Italy with 135%, and finally Japan with a staggering debt to GDP ratio of 236%. And of course, let's not forget about the US, which is facing the very same problem with a debt to GDP ratio of 124%. And such massive debts, whether you like it or not, represent more taxes and more inflation down the road, which will make these places less and less attractive for both investments and work. So in the long run, I believe that the capital currently parked in these developed regions will likely move towards better opportunities. And that's where Latin America comes in. So developed countries are facing massive debts. Okay, but how is the picture for these Latin American countries I mentioned? Well, starting with Argentina, the country has a debt to GDP ratio of 83%. Well, it's true that 83% is not that low, right? But it's still much lower than the numbers we see in most developed nations. However, the important thing about Argentina is that it's going through massive reforms. It is going through a massive deleveraging process. Argentina is already cutting a huge chunk of government spending so it can bring both debt and taxes down, thus positioning the country to become one of the great economic powers of the century, at least in my opinion. And that's by far the most important thing about Argentina right now. Now let's take a look at Uruguay. Uruguay is another country that, though it doesn't have a very low debt, is still in much better shape than most developed countries, with its debt to GDP at 70%. Now, regarding Mexico, as we see here, the country has a debt to GDP at 50%, and now we are getting into really low levels. And finally, we have Paraguay, with a debt to GDP ratio of only 45%, though as we see here, it's been trending up, which I obviously don't like to see, right? However, Paraguay is going through very significant economic reforms, for example, reducing the number of ministries, reducing costs, and so on. So I don't think their debt is going to explode, though that is indeed a possibility, right? Though that could happen eventually. In any case, a debt to GDP of only 45% can be considered quite healthy. But as we see, besides having a much better demographic profile than developed countries, these Latin American nations are also in much better fiscal shape. So while European countries, for example, might start to experience a lot of inflation in the future because of their debt problem, while they might need to raise taxes even further, that might not be the case in Latin America. So now it's time for us to talk about taxes, which is the second part of the fiscal factor. You see, as everybody knows, most developed countries tax you until you can't take it anymore. In some of them, you might pay 40%. Or almost 50% of what you earn in taxes. So yeah, a huge tax burden, right? For instance, according to what I found out using ChatGPT, in Germany, you pay 25% in taxes on your capital gains from your investments. And on top of that, from what I understood, and please correct me if I'm wrong, right? But on top of that, it seems there are other taxes as well. So man, it's pretty hard to make money in Germany. On your salary, from what I understood, you pay somewhere between 14% and 45% in income tax. I mean, that's crazy. In Portugal, where I am right now, it's pretty much the same too. However, in Latin America, the picture is completely different. For instance, do you know what the maximum tax you would pay in Paraguay is? Just 10%. That is, if you pay any taxes at all, because if your earnings come from abroad, you won't pay anything in taxes, as Paraguay operates under a territorial taxation system. In other words, you only pay taxes on the money you make within the country's borders, which is a huge advantage. Now, talking about Uruguay, in Uruguay on the other hand, you do pay more taxes. For example, if you work there, your income tax can go up to 36%, which in my opinion is quite high, right? Still, that's lower than in most developed countries. Well, it's certainly lower than 48%, right? However, since Uruguay also operates under a territorial tax system, any money you earn outside its borders is completely tax-free. And again, that's another huge advantage. It's not a surprise that a lot of people are going to Uruguay thinking exactly about that, about this tax benefit. Moreover, just like Paraguay, Uruguay also doesn't tax donations or inheritances, which is another great plus. So just imagine how many people and companies will probably be attracted only by these factors, only by these tax benefits. So that's one of the main reasons why I believe Latin America could see a growing wave of capital inflows. Because people are simply tired of paying abusive taxes in other parts of the world. And these countries offer a really good deal. Now, regarding Argentina, Argentina imposes taxes that can go up to 35%. And unlike Uruguay or Paraguay, it doesn't operate under a territorial tax system, but rather under a global tax system. However, again, the crucial thing about Argentina is the changes taking place right now. Milei's goal is to cut government spending until it's possible to bring taxes down. So in the future, I believe this scenario could change significantly, with Argentine taxes dropping considerably, making the country much more attractive to capital. And who knows, maybe their tax system could change, right? Maybe Argentina could adopt a territorial tax system in the future. Considering the liberal ideas there, I wouldn't be surprised by that. In any case, regarding Argentina, in summary, the main thing about it is the changes it is going through, not its current tax system, okay? That's crucial for us to keep in mind. And finally, we got to Mexico. You see, honestly, I don't think Mexico is a great tax play. Income taxes there can also go up to 35%, okay? And the country also doesn't operate under a territorial tax system, which is a big disadvantage. So regarding taxes, from what I understood, there's nothing particularly special about Mexico. On top of that, unlike what's happening in Argentina, the government in Mexico is not working towards economic liberalization. So unlike Argentina, I don't have big expectations about Mexico regarding an improvement in their tax system. On the other hand, Mexico does have a major advantage, which we'll get to in just a moment. But just to sum up this part of the video about the fiscal factor that could lead Latin America to start receiving more capital inflows, the main points are these. First, Latin America is far less leveraged and far less indebted than most developed countries. And on top of that, the taxes you'll pay there in Latin America are considerably lower, with some countries, such as Uruguay or Paraguay, offering excellent deals. So these were the fiscal factors that could shift capital inflows towards Latin America. And now we finally arrived in the third factor, in the third reason, why I believe Latin America, and most specifically these countries I mentioned, are heading towards economic success. And this third reason is related to geopolitics. So the first thing we need to understand to get why Latin America might boom is that the world is going through a strong deglobalization process. So if in the past it made sense for American companies, such as Apple for example, to have factories all over the world, taking advantage of the best each place had to offer, now that model needs to be rethought. In the same way, if in the past Germany, for instance, became an economic powerhouse by importing natural resources from other countries, such as natural gas from Russia, and exporting its high-end products to the US, for example, from now on, that's no longer possible anymore. And deglobalization is happening because the Americans, who are the ones responsible for our globalized world, simply don't have the resources nor the interest to maintain this global setup anymore. That's why we are seeing them stepping back from the stage and focusing more on themselves. To make things worse, the world is also a lot more unstable now. For example, we currently have a war in Europe, in Ukraine. This year, we also saw a war in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. And on top of that, China always appears as a threat, with a possible invasion of Taiwan. So the world is deglobalizing and becoming more unstable, which means there is an increasing risk of supply chains being disrupted again, just like we saw during the pandemic. That's why we are seeing this onshoring trend, which basically means American companies are bringing their entire supply chains closer to home. And well, what better place for US companies to set up than right there in the Americas, right? That's why Mexico made my list, because it's right next to the US, making it a perfect location for companies to relocate to. So we should start seeing a lot of American companies coming back to the continent and focusing on building their supply chains in the US, or in Latin America, which will obviously result in a lot of investments and in a huge capital inflow into that region. So that was our third factor, geopolitics, and more specifically, deglobalization. So basically, it's because of these three factors that I presented, demographics, the fiscal question, and geopolitics, that I believe capital will start flowing much more intensely into Latin America. Future growth won't come from Europe, for example. Forget Europe. Europe is done. Growth will come from somewhere else, and Latin America stands out as a major candidate. Now, to close this video, in which areas do I think each of these countries will perform best? What are the strong points of each, in my opinion? So, starting with Mexico, I believe that what will drive Mexico is mainly its location. The fact that Mexico is right next to the US in a time of deglobalization. And of course, its demographics will help a lot, right? Mexico has around 130 million people, with a large share of them still being young, which, again, could represent a massive future workforce as well as a huge consumer market. However, politically speaking, the country doesn't seem to be pursuing a path of more economic liberalization. The winds, unfortunately, don't seem to be blowing in that direction, which would help Mexico a lot. So by far, the most important factor about Mexico, at least for me, is its proximity to the US in a time of deglobalization. In terms of taxes, on the other hand, Mexico certainly doesn't stand out. Uruguay, in turn, stands out as an excellent destination for wealthy people. It's like the Switzerland of Latin America. It is likely to be the place that many wealthy individuals from other regions will seek out. Therefore, Uruguay's main strength is its tax regime. Now, regarding Argentina, the reason it made my list is because, first, it is one of the largest countries in the region, full of natural resources, and with a big and young population as well. It is true that Argentina doesn't stand out today as a fiscally attractive country since it has a considerable debt and an unfavorable tax regime. However, tectonic changes are taking place there that could totally turn things around. So basically, it's because of its demographics and the political shifts that could put the country on a phenomenal path that I chose Argentina. And finally, regarding Paraguay, it's true that Paraguay doesn't have a geographically advantageous position, right? For example, the country has no access to the sea. However, it has excellent demographics and a tax regime that will likely attract massive amounts of capital and investments. Besides, Paraguay has a very low debt to GDP ratio and is now going through further economic reforms that could make it an even more attractive place for investments. Paraguay may still be poor, but honestly, it's probably my favorite bet. So in summary, these were the strong points of each country. Now, to really close this video, why didn't Brazil make it to my list? After all, Brazil has a huge population, is full of natural resources, right? And it's the biggest country in the region, the biggest country in Latin America. Well, Brazil didn't make it to my list because of its government and because of the political path it is taking. The country is becoming increasingly hostile to capital, to investments, and it has been picking fights with the Americans instead of seizing the opportunity to align with them. So even though Brazil has a lot of potential, has an incredible potential, its policies simply don't let it move forward. Now, of course, this could change a little with the new government, right? However, in my view, Brazil needs a much more profound change, a change in its system, to be really able to progress. But honestly, as a Brazilian, that seems extremely unlikely. Anyway, that's it for today, and see you next time.